Well, hello again to Kensuke Conversations. I'm Rob Balfour.
And I'm Neve Rose.
And we have a very important guest with us this evening, Nigel OMara. And Nigel, I kind of heard about Nigel many years ago, because Nigel was actually one of the pioneers of Male Survivor Services United Kingdom in 1986, when Nigel was a co-founder of what we know as Survivors UK. And we're really pleased that Nigel is here. So I'll let Nigel continue the introduction by telling us a little bit more about himself and his history of childhood briefly, and then we'll talk about the history of male survivor development from his root of the Survivors UK Foundation. Over to you, Nigel.
Thanks, Rob. I'm Nigel OMara. I was born in Surrey in 1963, and since then I didn't have an easy childhood, going through care and being abused myself. The earliest part of my life wasn't very easy. It wasn't very palatable for people. What I try to do is learn throughout my life about things that happen to you that are bad and how to make that difference. But I didn't learn how to do that for the first 23 years of my life. Before that, I had to go through the abuse, the care system, and all the other problems with homelessness, being on the streets, working in prostitution, things that many people will know very well what that feels like. Going through that abuse system made me a very difficult person at first. I was very angry. I went through a period of taking drugs and alcohol to extremes. And it didn't make me think of myself. It made me stop blot out everything that I was thinking. So when it came to my early 20s, with the help of Richie McMullen from Streetwise UK, which was an organisation working with young people involved in prostitution, we started to notice that their helpline was getting calls from male victims of sexual abuse who weren't involved in prostitution, so weren't really relevant to the organisation. And at the same time, we heard that the Lesbian and Gay Switchboard were having the same issues. They were also having male victims of sexual abuse being referred to them to a gay organisation when they weren't necessarily even gay, but they'd had this experience. So that was when Survivors UK was formed, the idea of Survivors UK. And we called it Survivors UK because we were very well aware of the amount of people around us who hadn't survived. Those people that we'd lost through drugs, through suicide, through just living their life into the ground because they'd had no other choice, because they'd been abused. So we knew we were survivors, that's why it was.
What year was that, Nigel? So what period of time?
Well, UK was opened on the the first proper meeting was on the Friday 13th of June 1986.
Right. So
the organisation was set up, we thought we would only get a few calls in, and we didn't know how quick it would take off. If it would take off, we might not get any calls, and we might have wasted all our time. We really didn't know.
Sure, yeah.
And what happened was we got 300 calls in the first week.
Wow.
And as we got some publicity further,
we
were trying to formulate ways of going forward, because at that time it has to be remembered that male rape didn't exist as a crime.
Sure, yeah.
So there was nothing to fight against, as it were, because
Sure,
it didn't exist as far as the systems were concerned.
Sure.
So as far as the police were concerned, you didn't exist, you weren't important, and that's exactly how we were treated. At the ages of 12 and 15, I ran away from my care homes and reported to the police. On both occasions, I was told to go away and not take any further action. And in fact, that was reviewed in 2015, and they found that both of the people that I had accused, who were now dead, had been convicted paedophiles, convicted less than 6 months before, and came out of prison less than 6 months before my abuse. I reported them both, and both for non-action. When you're faced in the gears of state, the simple gears of state that are supposed to be there to protect you, and you realise that they're not there for you, it has a great effect on your ability to communicate with the rest of the world.
I mean, I come from a similar background to you, and I can really empathise with that perspective. So, as many of my peers, as many as your peers as well, that you've talked to in 40 years, is, I'm probably more able to kind of engage with the system, even though the system might argue that I don't engage very positively. Well, from my perspective, it is positive, but it kind of, because I'm polite. But as you know, for many of our peers, the hatred of the system is so deep for what it's betrayed them, and the police for not taking their complaints when they have the courage. It runs now 40, 60, 50 years after those events. They still think about that with a rage. I mean, as a folks, I've got this picture behind me, not because that's a representation of me. It was somebody who I picked that up, who painted that and lives in France. And it just kind of told me that the world needs to know that's what's inside little boys who've been raped, is this deep betrayal. And a lot of it's reinforced by the fact that the society tells them that they don't matter.
The state
and we're ignored
reinforces it. Yeah, the state reinforces it. And one of the other things about that is that as the state reinforces it, you've got two options. You go under or you fight.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah? And that's when we become survivors.
Indeed, yeah.
When we don't go under, we fight.
Yeah.
And we start calling back.
Yeah.
But when we were setting up these organisations, there were none of these discussions.
Right.
So there wasn't any research.
Sure, yeah.
Without any research, they weren't going to change the law.
Sure, yeah.
So that was really important to get that research published. We worked with St Mary's Hospital in Paddington,
Okay.
a great teaching hospital,
Yeah.
with Richard Hillman, Dr. Richard Hillman at the clinic there, and we put forward some research in 1990 and 1991.
Yeah.
Which was accepted into the British Medical Journal and the British Journal of General Practice.
Yeah.
So they've been published in the right format, and part of that was highlighting the fact that in this system there is no recourse. There's no law that is covering male rape.
Sure, yeah.
And that helped us greatly to go. In their first 8 years, all we were doing really was getting that law changed to make it illegal. Once we made it illegal, we had access to some kind of funding and some kind of more help and support with the organisation. It was all self-funded. Yeah. And it was all it's always been by survivors for survivors, and remains so to this day. It's mainly for by survivors.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you're also in a context of the paedophiles, and the paedophile exchange was kind of active at that time, wasn't it?
That's right. That's when they were a part of the National Council for Civil Liberties.
So that was like
national.
Harlan, who was the director of Liberty at that time, I think.
That's right. That was the organisation known as the Liberty International.
Yeah.
So if you've got the greatest human rights speakers in the country putting a platform up for the paedophile information exchange, which I may remind you, the legal officer for was Harriet Harman.
So you were operating a context there, because I'm a kind of fan of history, and you're in an environment where paedophiles were getting advocacy from one of the foremost human rights organisations in the world.
Yeah.
And the victims of the paedophiles were being vanished from all discourse because it wasn't seen as a crime.
Absolutely. But we had to change that attitude. And we could only do that by publicising, by getting out there and being open. Nobody wanted to come forward. I didn't want to come forward.
Sure,
I had to do it because nobody else would.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do it. You've got to start somewhere.
So what was that like, Nigel? Because I've done it, as you know, for 25 years.
Yeah.
And I've got to be honest with you, sometimes I'd wake up in the morning and think, I should have gone left when I went right, because it is painful to be disclosed in our world.
I managed to do it for blocks.
Okay.
So I could do that first 8 years. And we got the law changed. And at that time, I couldn't cope anymore.
Yeah.
I had a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
My partner at the time, Alex, God love him, he nursed me back through that in Italy.
Okay.
In the mountains in Italy. But it took 5 years.
Wow. And I can believe it, because all I know, it is like putting yourself in a storm, and the storm doesn't end because you're being projected on endlessly by people's stereotypes, fears, myths, and all the other crap they come up with. And it's endless. It's almost like you've entered, this is my experience of it, I don't know how you would define it. It's like entering a parallel, phased out universe. It's like you don't really exist anymore as the kind of human being that you thought you were. You're seen by people in this wholly new context. I know female survivors have experienced the same thing. And it's like suddenly people see you differently, and it's a tough place to be. So I'm thinking of what that must have been like in.
But this discussion about social acceptance, social awareness, there's something really important for me in that. When I first did it, when I was first being public, I got some real pushbacks. I got beaten. I got thrown out of a house. I had people spat at me in the street.
Oh, God.
It was awful at first. Over time, now if I do something in the media and somebody sees it, somebody's going to walk up to me and shake my hand.
Yeah, it has changed.
And that's the difference.
Yeah.
You have to make that social awareness change. We had no rights.
Sure,
Human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think people really get how you get, because the whole thing about, the paedophile had more validity in the eyes of what many of our kind would call the do-gooders, because they use that expression.
You're talking about also the time when Margaret Thatcher was taking Jimmy Stafford's hand and sending him the keys to Dartmoor.
And also kind of inviting him for Christmas dinner at wherever the
Great Ormond Street Hospital and all of these.
Stuff, it's kind of crazy world, wasn't it? So how did you manage then was it kind of by hand-to-mouth handouts from people to pay for the telephone bill?
Very much so. Very much so.
The notepads to take the details, because there were no computers in 1985. So kind of, it was a whole different universe.
The media does come some good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. It did mean that people from quite surprising organisations
Okay.
and places did come in and give donations.
Okay.
Yeah, and that over a couple of years period
Yeah.
gave stability
Okay.
and a good foundation for the organisation.
Because this was the age before the lottery, because the lottery didn't arrive
Yeah,
until
way before the lottery.
so there was trust funds around and all.
There
So they
were
oh,
educational trusts, charitable trusts.
yeah,
I don't know if you remember, you used to get the directory of grant making trusts
yeah, it's still out there. Still
and apply through there. Yeah,
so you can still get that. So
you can still get it. Yeah, but that was
you don't
the
get any money out of it, but you can still buy the books. That's kind of
yeah.
for doing the stuff. So there's tons of. So it was hand to mouth.
Yeah.
In a world
Very
that
much at the beginning. Very much.
didn't even see the subject. Amazing. So how many of you were there, Nigel? Okay.
And working there, I suppose over the years, different people came and went, 15, 20 people.
Sure, yeah.
Never many.
Yeah.
But at that time, we didn't need many.
Sure, yeah.
What we needed more was people to be there for the helpline that we offered.
Sure, yeah.
And really just trying to formulate where the organisation goes.
Sure,
We
yeah.
spent so much time on getting the law changed, on lobbying and writing letters to here, there and everywhere. Oh God, months and months and months of trying to get more information to reinforce their claim. Trying to get the media to actually say,
Yeah.
I think when I was first interviewed in the media, I was getting questions like, well, is it really a problem? Does it really exist?
Sure, yeah.
Shouldn't a man be able to fight against it?
Yeah.
Yeah, these were serious questions from journalists.
Yeah, would have believed that. That would be in there.
They were just the same part of society that we were.
So you still get that kind, but you don't get it as overtly as you used to. But it's definitely kind of there, I think. I think it takes a long time to change culture and for shifts and changes.
It does.
People, they default back to their comfort zones.
8 years. It does take time. If that change had been made, there's no going back.
I agree, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they can reverse now.
You can't reverse that.
Yeah.
What were those years like in terms of like trying to keep the momentum? Like there must have been times where you felt like this isn't getting anywhere. Like how did you kind of keep yourself pushing forwards? Because 8 years is a long time to be where obviously there's the passion behind it, but there must have been times where you thought this isn't changing. Was it kind of coming up with new strategies of how to kind of push for it, or what was the process?
Yeah, it was coming up with new strategies, new ideas, doing things that were newsworthy. So, for example, did the first ever training with the Metropolitan Police.
Wow.
So that was printed in the Standard, obviously. So you do things like that. I did a workshop for all of the agony aunts, Deirdre, Angela Rayner,
Yeah.
all of them. They all came, 7 of them. They all came. So all those sorts of interactions gave a little bit more publicity. Of course, I was at that time public relations officer,
Okay.
so I made sure they got into print.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very.
So these sorts of things, that basic general waking awareness,
Sure.
so that certainly with the agony answer, they would get a better response.
Sure. Yeah.
It was about a workshop to inform and educate people who were interested but didn't really understand what they should or shouldn't say or do. Getting that little bit of conversation going really worked. So by doing little bits of that, or running a course here, running a course there, you get it in the local paper. You got
Sure.
occasionally it would be a quiet day or something, and it would go national. You
Sure,
never
yeah.
knew. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I started, kind of the breaking the silence thing, which I can understand. But to me, it seemed it was more about challenging the silence. It was actually not the individual that was the issue. It was the culture that was silencing them. And therefore, the focus is what, as you were kind of articulating there, was to kind of shatter that by going out and kind of breaking, not the individual silence, but the cultural silence itself, and the diminishing and the avoidance and all those things. So
yeah, I did a recording of the documentary with Roger Cook.
Yeah.
That never got aired. I did several interviews, radio interviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was knowledge increasingly and awareness growing outside of...
That's right, and an empathy growing. An empathy growing with the general public.
Sure, yeah.
A greater understanding, because they're hearing about it more.
Sure, yeah.
Slowly you get a greater understanding of it, and you actually think about it rather than react to it.
I mean, I sometimes think now, after all these decades of doing the activism thing, is actually the real blocks to change are not in the community stuff, because often what people kind of know people who have, or they kind of know of it, it's kind of not a secret. There are people, obviously, that kind of have an issue with it. They just don't think anyone talks about it. So it's actually within systems itself. It's the systems that shut it down.
They make
the
it
people, professionals in the system who've got the issue. The community kind of gets it. I think young people...
Yeah, very often the community gets it.
Yeah.
Or most of them do.
Yeah.
And the ones that don't for a reason.
Yeah, we mean because they're kind of obviously. But the majority of people kind of resonates with them, especially if they're not kind of educated out of that connection to it. They kind of see it for what it is, really. So we do a lot of work with professionals. That's some very good people in the NHS and other agencies. But the ones we really find easy to work with are people in the private sector who come from it from a very different perspective.
Yeah.
Hey, they want money, obviously, but they're actually kind of, they're just easy. They just don't have any, they don't have any baggage about it.
Yeah.
It's kind of, they're not carrying all these weird theories and things of kind of distress and disorder and all the rest of it. They just say, oh, God, that's really, really awful. What can we do to help? And they kind of go, there's no filter. It's kind of straight to it. Whereas I think if you've been educated in social whatever or psychology and all the rest of it, there's a kind of almost default to victim blaming is probably too strong a word for it, but it's kind of putting the victim into
trying to lighten everything.
It's kind of it's interesting, isn't it, how it works? And so you were up against all of that in a time when there were opportunities because it was an open conversation was ready to be had, where you were kind of there. So I thought it was tough in the early 2000s, but I can't imagine what it was like in the 80s.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't easy.
I genuinely, you have my absolute admiration, because I know what it was like in 1999 to step out into the light and to start talking about it and the responses that you got. And that was a kind of more informed time in many ways. But now in the middle of the 80s, 15 years earlier, the age of the yuppie and the age of all the rest,
exactly.
And no real laws, and it was almost like it was still the 1960s in many ways.
Very much.
So I was in a different world in the 80s. So it kind of said, well, so I know what the world would have been like for you in the 80s. And that's kind of, I really have my admiration for having to have lasted 2 days in that would have been, most people wouldn't have been able to do it. So, because people said to me,
I think I was driven to get that one thing done.
And it is a drive, isn't it?
And it is that. It's about taking that drive and focusing on that one thing. Everything else is peripheral. It's all small steps towards that one thing. That is how I cope with that situation. At any period, it's tough. Yeah. There's no anyone starting up an organisation now has it just as tough, especially if they're dealing with something which isn't quite covered by the law. If you're trying to do that, then it's a tough time at the moment.
I mean, the world has changed. I mean, in some ways, it's better, isn't it? So,
in some ways, it's better. People have moved on a long way from when we started.
So when you started, it was you. So when I appeared, I found it was the dawn of the internet. So that was an advantage. So the internet was dawning in 1997, 98, 99. Though I was really starting to think about it in 97. And then the internet allowed you, because I was looking to be able to buy a desktop computer and to dial up and do the emails and things that were appearing on websites for government agencies, because they weren't protecting any of the directors' emails. So you could email directly to people, realize what was going to happen. And so you could fire off these direct communications. Because they just took them, but they didn't realize the world they were in.
Well,
so you've been kind of out there doing that for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I just remember how difficult it was, because there must something. You then had the breakdown, so you end up in Italy recovering, and the World of Survivors UK continued.
It was never about one person, Survivors. Ever. There's no way it was going to fold by just one person doing anything, going anywhere. Yeah. It wasn't about that.
Sure, yeah.
It wasn't about me. It was about getting the thing done.
So it was about what I call the mission.
Yeah.
So it wasn't about, it wasn't about you. So, whilst you were important to it because we all get something from activism. So I think, it'll be...
Oh, yeah, I did. I certainly did.
To deny that we get something personally from it, I think it would be, completely wrong. But there's a difference between getting something from it and having a mission and actually it only being all about you anyway. That's the difference, I think, for some activists. With some activists, it is only about them, and the mission is secondary to them.
For me, the mission is first. Always.
The mission is always first. I think the mission is always first.
There was a book written in, that was in 1989, by a social scientist called Mogball, who had previously written Education for a Change.
Okay.
You remember that book?
Okay.
But the introduction to the book, which was about young people getting involved in volunteering, the first chapter was about me.
Okay.
But the introduction to that book was written by Prince Charles, now the King.
Okay. All right.
And that was in 1989.
Yeah.
That support that wasn't a lot of support, but a little bit of support that he gave by introducing that did a lot to give credibility in other circles. It's been very important later on. I'm able to prove these things happened, and that for me has been extremely important. I wouldn't have got core participation status from the inquiry if I hadn't had it. If I hadn't been able to prove by the research, so all those things that I was doing then actually helped me later. Because when it came around to calling for the inquiry, when I was asked to come back to England in 2012 by a very good friend of mine who said that they thought there was a chance that we could get an inquiry going.
Okay.
Would I come back to the country? And
So I remember 2012. Well, you may not be aware of this, or you might be aware of this. So 2012, the explosion of the Savile scandal, which kind of sent the system into panic attack because suddenly, all the kind of hidden stuff that had been going on, at the highest levels, and that triggered, the call for an inquiry. So we won't go into the history of the first couple of chairs because that was like an adventure. But just before that, there was a big meeting in London, which I attended, with Theresa May, in all fairness to her. And it was a big round table meeting where she was scoping with who was to become the final chair of the inquiry was there. He was actually behind her as an advisor, kind of sitting on her side, and discussed in great detail what an inquiry would achieve and what it was aimed to do. And that took place in November 2014. But they had a series of chairs.
They had a series of chairs, yeah.
And they looked at having baronet, a retired female judge as well, who had done inquiries into Cleveland.
Who was related to Accuser.
So it was kind of, that was thrown out. So they kind of went through, and then there was a lot of activism stuff that went on.
One of the first things Professor J did as when she took over was made me a court participant.
So I was made a court participant by the New Zealand judge.
Yeah.
So Goddard made me a court participant, and then there was kind of that's how I became a court participant of the inquiry. And my view of it is that the £200 million is a lot of money, but it's kind of produced massive amount of data that hopefully will bring real change.
Make a difference, yeah.
So it's going to make a change. Then it's worth £200 million to do it. But anyone can't deny the reality of this stuff anymore, because it's actually in that archive of data that they collected forensically, because that's what they are, forensic investigations of history and people's kind of thing. But there's never been any, I think for a lot of people, there's never been any accountability, has there? There's never been a chief executive of a local authority who kind of just looked the other way, and other chief executives of the same authority, and I think you probably know where I'm talking, who kind of almost dished.
Well, you could say that about so many different authorities.
And all of these things. And
I could name you 20 authorities that applies to.
And so and they never lose their pensions. No. They're never kind of sanctioned in a public way. We've seen something with the post office where they've had to hand back their CBE voluntarily. But whether there's any legal action against them at the end of that inquiry for horrendous crimes against people of miscarriages of justice, you can't think of anything worse to be sent to prison for something you never did. So that is kind in also the sexual violence stuff. So for me, it's kind of, there's no accountability. I think if we have a law of transparency and accountability for your actions, the system will never shift. It will kind of sit in its kind of default position of divide and rule, kind of let's keep it all minimised, let's control and manage things, all of these things. And so change was always coming through strategies. But as somebody who's a leading strategy thinker said on Twitter, because she used to be a chief executive of a large authority, she'd never seen a strategy, and I quote, "I've never seen a strategy that's ever actually been fully implemented." So she's never seen one. She'd never seen one in her whole 30 years that's actually ever been put into place. Kind of, there's a great industry about creating them, but actually implementing them. And anyway, to come back quickly, I actually said that to Theresa May at the end of the meeting. We had a 2-hour meeting with her. It was kind of 2-hour meeting with the Home Secretary is a rare thing. And I'm sitting very close to her. And she looked at me and I said, and she asked if there were any final kind of comments. I said, all of this is wonderful. And it's kind of great that you're doing this. And I think it's a historic moment. There'll be this inquiry. But the proof of the pudding will be in its implementation of its recommendation. But only if it doesn't change anything, because it isn't implemented, because it sits on a shelf and gathers dust, and it's a great piece of academic forensic legal research, but it actually doesn't shift.
Yeah, it doesn't make any changes.
Then it would be a waste of 200 million quid, and whatever it's going to cost. And I said that will be a travesty of justice, because it needs to change. So that'll be my frustration with it. So, and then the rest is history, as they say, because you were more involved in that than me. So I was kind of kept well away from the national inquiry because I'm quite outspoken. But you were kind of sitting there, because I remember you coming. I actually did attend it once or twice, and you were there kind of almost daily, making kind of.
I was there for 42 days straight,
which is a long time to sit in one of those inquiries.
It is a long time. That was all of the accountability and reparations module hearings that I was a core participant to that module.
Yes,
So
same
I wanted to hear everything in that module.
Yeah.
I wanted to be able to
Yeah.
put in something. The very first time I went into the inquiry chambers on the very first day of the inquiry
Yeah.
was the first and only time somebody told me to sit down and be quiet at the back.
Okay, that was very kind of nice of them, wasn't it? So
Yeah, that didn't go down well, and they found that they had the choice of, you will just lose survivor support for this if you carry on in this sort of, you're not going to come here to talk. I'm a core participant. I'm going to participate whether you like it or not. They came back and said, yep, you're right. What we're going to do is in every session we're going to spare X amount of time for survivors to make their points so that they have a chance to put in. And that was carried on throughout all of the those parts of the inquiry.
And especially I watched that when there were the seminar parts where they kind of had the round table seminars, and you were off camera, but you were asked at the end by the chair of the seminars, because they had the normal kind of...
That I had to put in on the first day. It was about hearing survivors' voices at the inquiry.
So I think that's right. So I agree absolutely. I thought the seminars were the best part of it, to be honest with you. So I think the forensic examination is fascinating if you like listening to barristers kind of go through their questions and stuff, and that's all part of that process.
I do actually quite like that.
So I get that bit about it, but the best part for me, and I watched a lot of it when it was live, because a lot of it was live stream, and of course you got the transcripts because you were a core participant. They send you the transcripts for every hearing, so you could read them back and things. So it was. To me, that was the seminars were the best bits, because you really start to hear some of the complexity of the perspectives and the issues that surrounded survivors.
But it also set legal landmarks.
Okay.
The inquiry.
Okay.
For example, I gave an evidence on Tuesday.
Okay.
I think it was 15th September 2018, that the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority.
Okay.
They're the people who compensate when somebody's had a suffered a crime.
Yeah.
And all of their scenarios with victims of sexual abuse were female victims.
Yeah.
They had no male victims. As a result of that, people who've had their seeker claims refused previously now, and some have been successful now in getting their claims reviewed on the basis that up until that time, seeker weren't trained to look for it. On the Thursday afterwards, so that's 2 days after, the Home Office came in to the inquiry and said that training has been changed.
Sure, yeah. So it had an impact.
So it had an impact.
Over 8-9 years it ran, didn't it?
Yeah.
So it did happen. I think history will show that it had a lot of impact.
Well, the big impact was in 2015 when the police decided to start looking at historic cases, as they called them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
before that, they wouldn't even entertain it.
So there was a review process through the Director of Public Prosecutions as well. So
that was brought about because the inquiry existed.
What's fascinating to me now, Nigel, is kind of your perspective of kind of taking that journey from the beginnings of male voice in the kind of the space called sexual violence, and switching the narrative around, that males were just not seen as co-participants in the abuse, basically.
It took 15 years for the journalists to stop calling me a rent boy and start calling me a survivor.
Where in the 1980s and the early 90s, rent boy was a default term for all boys who'd been abused. Oh, he's a rent boy. It's kind of like, he's a bum boy. Is another one.
His fault. It's his fault. He's a rent boy. Not he's being abused by somebody through coercion.
I remember when I first closed, someone said to me, someone who a colleague at work who worked in a mental health service, and I said to kind of very first days of disclosure, really. And I told her, and I got on very well with her, so we used to go play golf together and stuff. And yeah, she's a lovely person, but their first default was, "Did you fight back?" Well, I was 6, and it wasn't because she was blamed; it's because she had boys of her own.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a default was, my boys would fight back, and that wouldn't happen to them. It's kind of like a human response. So it wasn't blaming me directly. It was kind of more a projection onto her own fear about her own children when I look back and do it. You still felt it, because it was like, it's not what you want to hear, is it, when you kind of disclose, did you fight back? But it was, but that was the world we were in when you disclose. It's kind of...
It is. My mother never spoke to me for 15 years after I disclosed.
It's crazy, isn't it? So my mother suffered from mental health issues as well. So she never knew that I'd been abused, so because she died very young. But so what do you make of it now, all of it now, where we are? Because it is a different landscape to when I started.
Absolutely, it's a different landscape. But that doesn't mean it's easy.
No, I'm not. I'm not
We
saying
have to realise that although we come to understand different ways of doing things, and a lot of adults now understand that, actually kids don't.
Sure, yeah.
And they shouldn't.
Sure, yeah.
Hopefully they'll never have to learn about it.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. We can put in some safeguards by doing right safeguarding training and things like that, and making sure we inform young people about their own bodies and how to stay safe with them as much as possible, and how that if they aren't able to keep safe with them, it's not their fault.
Sure, yeah.
That's always going to be remembered. It very often gets forgotten. It's not just think about them, it's reassurance. It's not your fault.
Really. This is not complicated rocket science stuff.
No, but it's very basic. It's very basic, but it's absolutely forgotten by so many safeguarding trainers. Yeah.
So why do you think what is, to me, relatively simple kind of way of constructing a kind of engagement?
Because it's too simple. They take it as read. Because they think of it like that, as read. Oh, that's as read. You don't need to teach that. That's as read. No, you do need to teach it to children because it's not as read. They haven't read it yet.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Because even the way they still respond, and we get calls where people are dealing with adults, very young, increasingly young male adults who are disclosing, especially around 18, 16 to 25. There's much more of them appearing now than what I've ever seen before. And everybody's seeing that. So there's a culture
I think that's
shift.
about better awareness.
I think it is. I think that's what I'm telling people is the stats. And I think the Ministry of Justice and others are seeing those trends. They're crunching the numbers at the moment from a massive data dive they did with all their funded agencies about 3 months ago. So they're crunching all of that data at the moment. And I think the trend is for younger and younger disclosure. The issue is...
That's great, actually.
It is great, really. The issue is when they're disclosing in new environment, in the environments. Even now, people in those environments are struggling to deal with it in a way that's kind of appropriate. So they either go into panic mode, so they can immediately default to ring up, we need counselling for this person, and trying to push them through the counselling door, which is, you're a counselling service and you're ticking boxes is great. But actually, as we discussed earlier on, if you push somebody who has been raped as a 6-year-old into an LGB service because you think they must
appropriate referral, not a referral.
It's got to be appropriate referral. So it's not about just passing them on and you can't deal with it. So it's kind of thing. So we have those conversations because the person discloses to somebody because they feel safe with that person. So it's about capturing that for me and kind of holding it whilst you help them to take a deep breath and to kind of then navigate the way to where they want to be in relation to the next steps. Because counselling isn't an antibiotic. It's
no, it's not, and it's not for everyone.
And it's
Some
not for everyone.
people really don't react well to it. There are many different medications in different therapies.
Sure, yeah.
And I think most of them are valid.
Sure, yeah.
most of them will do something for somebody,
Sure, yeah.
but none of them will do everything for everyone.
So it is that classic cliche, isn't it? It's a journey.
It is a journey.
And it's an exploration from my own perspective of yourself.
But I think we're in a much better situation now than we used to be. When we look at the amount of mail services around the country,
Absolutely.
there are so many more than there used to be.
So it's a complete revolution.
But there are still pockets, especially urban pockets or rural pockets.
There are big gaps,
Nigel, where there's nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. And the big conversations go on about how there's kind of explorations about how you.
My own case in point, in 2018, after I give my evidence, I asked the inquiry for help.
Yeah.
Help for counselling support.
Sure.
They referred me to my GP.
Right.
I started the therapy 4 months ago.
Funding.
My GP just simply didn't believe me.
Your GP didn't believe
No.
you? Well, that's crazy, Nigel. So, it's absolutely.
So she didn't even refer me for 2 years.
That is great.
She had a letter from the inquiry. Got to 4 years. I got the surgery to write to the inquiry. The inquiry responded and said, "We are sorry you have failed our core participant." Now I've got a letter from the inquiry saying that the NHS has failed their core participant, but that didn't give me the therapy. I still didn't get the therapy for another year.
So it's
that
not
got
the
me onto the waiting list, though.
So it's not the GP. It's not the GP's role to believe or disbelieve.
Oh,
the
no.
GP role is to assess and then refer you to the appropriate pathway. I also think that survivors need choice, as you rightly pointed out.
Absolutely.
One pathway, one thing. Even if you put it
Doesn't
all in
work
one
for everyone.
organization,
Doesn't
you need
work
to
for
have.
everyone.
And not every survivor will like the ethos in one organisation, and they may want to go to another organisation. So you don't need 5,000 of them. I get it, but you need
a variety.
You need a variety, and they should work together, to kind of make the gaps, for instance, disappear.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong, and I've done it, of saying to people, I don't feel comfortable counselling you because I know you for this or this.
Sure,
But what I will do is make sure that I pass you on to somebody who you will feel comfortable with.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I don't think we own survivors.
No,
I think
we don't.
They own us.
They own us, yeah.
If we can't give them we can give them as much bespokenness as we can, but you can't. There's no capacity to give them a perfectly person model of delivery because it's just impossible to do.
It's absolutely impossible for any organisation to do. But what they can do is do one part of it very well.
So that's what I aim to do, is one part of it very well, and then do the other bits that we can, and then signpost to people who can do the other bits, and kind of give people a landscape of choice. So I call it, I tell survivors when I speak to them, be a good consumer. So you kind of go checking out which one's going to fit for you.
And I think organisations should be telling people who come to them about other organisations in the area for that very reason, and saying, if you're not quite sure about it here, why not have a look here, and maybe that will be better for you. Or if you prefer to be here, obviously it will help.
So I do that, but I don't think, and a lot of people, they'll simply say, well, I've checked them out, I want to be in your service, so it's okay. So you're kind of doing the stuff, but I'm absolutely sure there's a lot of services across a lot of sectors that don't do that.
Yeah, and I think that's a no-brainer, because it's only giving choice to the survivor. And if you're really there for the mission, which is about survivors, that should be your first thought.
There's also a big issue about waiting lists. So, there are some services that have the capacity that don't particularly have waiting lists, and other services have large waiting lists for lots of reasons, and they don't pass on those waiting lists to other people. They kind of keep those waiting lists, and I won't give an example who it was. It's not anybody in the kind of male survivor sector particularly. It was a sector outside of that who were doing counselling, and they said they wouldn't pass, even though their funding had come to an end or was frozen, and they had a waiting list. They were not going to tell the guys on the waiting list that another service could pick them up for counselling, because if they did that and they entered their waiting list, then when they went for funding bids, in effect, they could say they couldn't evidence the need for them to be funded.
Yeah.
In effect, that's what they were saying. I think that's personally, I think
that's
think
not putting
that very
survivor first.
So it is that kind of landscape. So it is a landscape of funding politics and survival of the service and stuff. So some of us would be here whether we got paid or not. So you kind of do it because you do it, because you're kind of driven to do it. It's kind of,
I have never, in my whole life, ever been paid.
So is that by choice, Nigel? Is it
yes,
not?
Absolutely.
So you choose not to be paid.
I choose not to be paid.
So that's a different thing. So choosing not, and I get that.
And I choose it for a reason.
Okay.
It's,
so for some of us,
to me, is an absolutely disgusting thing.
Absolutely.
And I can't make money out of that.
So it's not about making money, I think, and I get it. I was like that. I was your view for a long, long time, and I didn't actually earn anything until.
I've always worked otherwise.
So I've worked elsewhere, so I could do that. So, but once you stop working, if you're going to develop a service, then you cannot not be paid because you have to live and survive as well. So that's the reality of it. I think the difference is when it becomes about the job. So it's about the money rather than the actual mission. So we all need to pay our rent. We all need to live. We need to eat and stuff. So for me, if you're able to kind of do your activism without the need to be paid for it, I get that. So I think that's fine. I think if you, because I've done it myself, or I tell people to get paid if they go on and do keynotes. And I'm being a hypocrite because I spent a decade doing keynotes for nothing. So because I thought it was changing the world until it finally dawned on me that perhaps the world wasn't changing the way I thought it was. So all of those things are real. So there's a lot of that stuff, but services are increasingly professionalising. So there's the drive to do, and that's a good thing. So it's a good thing that they're professionalising and they're kind of starting to see things in a much more kind of professionalised way. But the risk is they lose that
individualism,
which is what you are articulating.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not about you being paid, it's about the ethos of doing something for your own kind that doesn't have a tag to a check. But it's that element that you're identifying, I think, is the bit that gets lost when you grow.
Yeah.
And then
it's that element that's essential to start up this sort of thing.
And it's essential, I think.
You can't do it expecting. At the beginning, there was no way anyone was getting paid.
No, absolutely. In the days when you started, that wasn't.
It certainly wasn't until much more recently that anyone was paid in the sector.
And now over the last 10 years, people, for rape crisis and everybody else have grown exponentially, really, in the last 10 years. So that has been a massive shift forward. Anyone who denies it is living in a kind of illusion. But there is a long way to go. Would you like to come back for a part 2?
I think so.
We can pick up on this conversation because I'm fascinated by what you're articulating. And we can talk about the present because we started on that now. And then we can talk about the future and what is going to work for survivors. Because you have a really, for me, it's kind of like your perspective from that moment of the generation of a voice for male survivors, probably the first time in the world, I suspect.
Yeah, there's no research published before.
So you were Survivors UK at that moment in time. So there's a lot to talk about, actually. Yeah, but I've really enjoyed our conversation. So let's do part 2.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Very good. So on that note, as Neva, you have anything to say to Nigel before we close it down? Kind of.
I'll save it for part 2. Yeah.
Part 2.
So I'll let Neve say good night to the audience because we are nighttime. We're kind of recording.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and Thanks, Nigel, for coming on and chatting to us. I look forward to part 2. Yeah.
Thank you very much.